All right, it is 11 o'clock in Japan Standard Time. Time to kickstart the talk today. Welcome to the fourth talk of a 2022 webinar series hosted by the Global Education Office, Graduate School of Education at Kyoto University. I am Keita Takayama, the Director of Global Education Office, and I will be the moderator for today's webinar talk. We have been running a year-long webinar series titled, Can the Model of Japanese Education Withstand the Diversity Challenges? Today, we're going to host Dr. Lisa Liu, who is a visiting scholar at Stanford University, USA. Her talk is titled, Developing a Harmony-Based Approach to Student Diversity, Multiculturalism in Taiwan Schools. You might be wondering why today's talk is about Taiwan, when the whole webinar series is supposed to be about the model of Japanese education. So let me explain. I learned of Lisa's work through a group of East Asian researchers that have been co-leading towards a special issue in a journal called East China Normal University Review of Education. Back in 2020, I publicized a call for expression of interest for the special issue contribution that will be co-editing, and Lisa was one of the 11 people who expressed interest in being part of the group. Since then, we have been meeting online from time to time, supporting each other's writing. So I got to know Lisa's work through this project and asked her to give a talk on the basis of the paper she was developing towards the special issue. What I appreciate the most about her paper is that she's rather critical of East Asian education researchers, including some Japanese researchers, by the way, who draw upon the North American literature on multicultural education in assessing what teachers in East Asia do or fail to do in their schools. To put it differently, much of the existing international discussion on the state of multicultural education in East Asia resorts to the discourse of deficit, and that is focusing exclusively on what is missing or what teachers are not doing in East Asia. I find Lisa's argument very relevant to our webinar series because I am of the view that many Japanese education researchers are keen to import the multicultural education scholarship of North American researchers, including, for example, James Banks, Gloria Ladson-Billings, Geneva Gay, and the so-called whiteness studies, just to name a few. And oftentimes they focus on how Japanese teachers are not recognizing diversity in classrooms, or how they are not challenging the underpinning assumptions of Japaneseness, which is an equivalence to whiteness in their teaching practices. While their rather critical, often scathing critiques might be helpful for some, they could be more thoughtful about the fact that they are applying a yardstick developed out of very different cultural, institutional context of North America to the context of Japanese education. It is in this sense that Lisa's work will be relevant to us in Japan, and we can learn a lot from how she tries to develop a much more nuanced, locally grounded way of appreciating how Taiwanese teachers embrace cultural, linguistic diversity in their schools. As her talk will demonstrate today, Taiwanese teachers she studied took a very subtle and often hidden approach to cultural diversity at the school, and this would be overlooked if the researchers were applying the North American theory of multicultural education in a mechanical and unthoughtful fashion. Lisa is currently a visiting scholar at Stanford University, where she completed her Ph.D. dissertation on rural migrant children in public schools in Shanghai. She was appointed as an assistant professor at Hong Kong University and now back at Stanford. Her article, Educational Injustice in a High-Stakes Testing Context, a mixed method study on rural migrant children's academic experiences in Shanghai public schools, was awarded the 2020 George Beatty Award, the award given to the best article of the year published in Comparative Education Review, which is the flagship journal of a Comparative and International Education Society, known as CIES. Some of her recent articles have been published in top international journals, such as Comparative Education, Compare, and Comparative Education Review. It is a pleasure to host Lisa's talk today, and please welcome Lisa.
Keita, thank you for the warm welcome, and I'm honored to be here sharing my findings, and I hope that I can also learn from you as well during the discussion afterwards. So I'll just go ahead and get started. So as Keita mentioned, I will be speaking specifically on developing a harmony-based approach to student diversity, focusing on multiculturalism in Taiwan schools. In recent decades, social, economic, and demographic changes fuel the unprecedented challenges now facing East Asia's education system. Educational practitioners throughout East Asia now face the challenge of adapting to a changing student population in terms of socioeconomic class, language, and ethnicity. These are a few headlines that actually reflect the challenges now facing East Asia schools. I specifically want to highlight this picture of 9-year-old little Sai, who starred in Gangnam Style music video and became popular in South Korea. However, once it became known that he was half Korean, his mother is Vietnamese, he started to become bullied. Unfortunately, the alienation this boy faces is reflective of experiences of other immigrant youth across East Asia. So the question that I pose is, how can Asia's educators effectively respond to new forms of student diversity? A unique aspect of this challenge facing East Asia is that these are national contexts that have been relatively homogeneous in terms of language and ethnicity, as well as historically prioritized cultural and ethnic unity above difference. Educational leaders and educators in East Asia consider multicultural education as a solution to their increasing student diversity. As a field, multicultural education aims to enhance school policies, pedagogy, and curriculum to equalize learning opportunities to students of diverse backgrounds. It's important to highlight that such knowledge has sociocultural roots in the US, where it emerged in the 1960s. By multicultural education, I'm specifically referencing culturally relevant pedagogy, which is a critical pedagogy that resists assimilationist school curricula and ideologies, seeking to empower students to appreciate their diverse identities while succeeding academically. As noted by the asterisks, culturally relevant pedagogy is known by many different names, including culturally responsive teaching. Here, I highlight the 3 main dimensions, which include sociopolitical consciousness of inequality, which allows students to develop and acknowledge how to address inequality, promoting academic success for students, and facilitating their cultural competence by affirming their cultural identity and cultural origin while developing fluency in the dominant culture. Multicultural education is globally touted by UNESCO. The reason it's adopted by schools and teacher education programs worldwide is that it's considered a best practice, global knowledge and wisdom of practice in educational and academic communities. The prominence of such global multicultural knowledge motivates Asia's policymakers and educational leaders to accept multicultural education as the solution for their schools. However, some scholars problematize the import of multicultural education to non-Western contexts. According to these scholars, teaching is shaped by the social cultural context in which it's embedded and cannot be culture-free. Consequently, given its US roots, multicultural education is defined according to Anglo-American paradigms that emphasize equity, individuality, and independence. These paradigms emerge from the West's historical context, where justice was historically considered the core virtue for ordering interpersonal relations and establishing a stable society centered on individual rights. These social cultural values are reflected in this global multicultural knowledge from the US context. And here I just highlight the equity focus on the left, as well as the individual focus of promoting academic success and cultural competence of individual students. Consequently, when multicultural education practices are imported into non-Western educational contexts, teachers can actually experience cultural dissonance. In fact, research documents East Asian teachers struggling to implement multicultural best practices. An example is this quote in a recent Taiwan study. Taiwanese teachers struggled between the push of the CRT theories they had just learned and the pull of the Confucian social traditions they had lived with their whole lives and which was reflected in the teaching culture as a hidden curriculum. I highlight this quote to show the deficit lens that is applied to East Asian culture and traditions, viewing East Asian culture as an obstacle to effectively responding to student diversity. There is an urgent need to diversify our approach to diversity with alternative educational models. The need for alternative multicultural models is recognized by Dr. Lee Ching Ho, a scholar of multiculturalism in Singapore. She writes, East Asian understandings of multiculturalism may substantially differ from how it's been conceptualized in North America or Europe. Equity is an integral element of Western conceptualizations of multicultural education. Given that harmony is a deep-rooted value in societies with a Confucian tradition, East Asian perspectives on multiculturalism and its manifestations in education deserve further systematic scholarly attention. Her quote highlights first the sociocultural roots of the globally dominant multicultural education model in the US. Two, she advocates for East Asian scholars to explore multicultural practices from their own unique context. Because when East Asian educators import this globally dominant multicultural model as a best practice, they overlook their own cultures and histories as a contextual resource in responding to student diversity. Third, she specifically highlights harmony and Confucian tradition as one resource to consider in an alternative multicultural model. So here I highlight Confucianism, which is a philosophy that emerged from Confucius, whose teaching focuses on personal morality, harmony, as well as justice and sincerity. And his influence has reached many, many places throughout East Asia. A central value, as identified by Dr. Ho of Confucianism, is harmony, which defines the individual by their social role within the larger group and emphasizes mutuality and reciprocity, prioritizes group solidarity, and focuses on coexistence of difference and diversity. Building on the work of Dr. Ho and other scholars who acknowledge East Asia's cultures, knowledge, and histories constitute potential assets in reimagining multicultural education from an East Asian perspective, this paper explores an alternative to the Western-based multicultural model with East Asia as a reference, and hopes to lay a foundation for future research by other scholars in neighboring Asian societies. It does so through exploring an alternative multicultural approach through a case study on Taiwan, where policymakers and educators are responding to new forms of student diversity in the form of multi-ethnic youth from transnational marriage migrations. Many of the foreign wives in these marriages originate from Southeast Asian countries, particularly Vietnam. These foreign wives typically marry a Taiwanese man who is generally, on average, it's usually a rural, impoverished, and low income, as well as low educational attainment man who's unable to attract a local Taiwanese woman to marry. These female marriage migrants, and in fact, these transnational marriages often face social stigma because of Vietnam's perceived low economic status relative to Taiwan. So the resulting children of these marriages are called New Taiwanese children. In this talk, I identify them as NTC, and they now comprise 1 out of every 10 primary and middle school age children in Taiwan. So the questions I address in this study are, how did Taiwanese teachers and staff in one progressive school attempt to address differences of culture and develop NTC's ethnic identities? Second, what contextual factors influence teachers' multicultural practices? And third, how might multicultural theorizing and practice respond? To answer these questions, I focus on Bronfenbrenner's ecological framework, which demonstrates the influence of social environments on human development and behavior. I modify his schema to center on the teacher and focus on the main constructs of interest for this study. Every educator's practice and policymaking is embedded in a system of contexts that interact with their daily decisions. Here I focus on the macro and the exosystem and how they influence teachers' responses to student diversity. So the green is in the middle, this circle is the educators' response to student diversity in terms of practices and policies. And the brown is the exoskeleton. These are settings that actually do not involve the teacher as an active participant, but indirectly influence teachers by affecting the school, such as Ministry of Education policies. The macro system in the orange refers to settings that do not refer to the specific environments of teachers, but the already established society and culture in which the teacher is embedded. So an example of this is the social cultural context, or dominant patterns of ideas and practices in the social system that teachers and administrators view as salient in responding to student diversity. So each context is actually Confucian influenced in this study, and I will be describing it further in the following slides. But first, let me describe the methods and the data. So to study Taiwanese teacher multicultural practices, data originated from one school, which was recommended by multiple National Taiwan University education faculty for the school's commendable work on diversity with NTC youth. The school is a combined middle and high school located in a low-income rural community with a high population of NTC and marriage migrants. Data was collected over a series of visits in Mandarin, and interview participants for the teachers varied in the subjects that they taught and their teaching experience and their administrative roles. All the teachers were Taiwanese, except for one teacher who grew up in Macau. And each participant had at least 2 individual interviews, which were audio recorded and then transcribed. I then coded the transcripts using a coding scheme based on the literature, the research questions, as well as emergent themes from the data. So to go into the findings, how did Taiwanese teachers and staff in a school attempt to address differences of culture and develop students' ethnic identities? I found that there was a harmony-oriented pedagogy that they actually used to maintain social harmony. And there were 3 core features that I'll be talking about: whole person development, strengthening the collective school, and a school decision-making process that prioritizes fairness. So first I address this idea of whole person development, which is that the teacher's reason to actually want to promote students' acceptance of their cultural identity was to strengthen their relationship with their mothers, in essence, to strengthen their family, and because they consider this a moral issue. So a teacher actually shared, I became troubled when I observed 3 academically strong new Taiwanese children who did not treat their Vietnamese mothers with respect. As a teacher, I wondered, what am I doing if I train academically outstanding children who do not treat their parents with respect? What is striking about this teacher sharing is that she's prioritizing the students' family relationships above academic excellence. In fact, one of the students she's referring to won a national award for their academics. This teacher's concern beyond academic achievement illuminates a whole person education that Confucianism actually touted that aims to develop students intellectually and morally in East Asia. Other teachers also expressed concern about the consequences of poor child-mother relationships in the family, realizing that their students were rejecting their ethnic identities because of the shame they felt towards their mothers. So they believe that if they promoted these ethnic identities and they accepted their identities, they would be more likely to respect their mothers. And here I'm highlighting how these quotes actually echo the Confucian belief that education is much more than just imparting knowledge and skills, but it's actually a way of improving the self to become a moral and ethical person. And according to Confucian ethics, the family was the most important group because it was the basis for organizing society. So you can see that this is one core feature of this pedagogy, motivating multicultural practices. A second core feature was strengthening the school unit. So teachers ultimately had to strike a balance. Teachers ultimately had to strike a balance between recognizing new NTC's individual identities and cultivating a strong collective consciousness between NTC and non-NTC youth. Teachers really wanted to encourage students to build an attitude of interdependence with their classmates. Such a balance actually reflects the Confucian notion of harmony, as an individual is an interdependent self, defined by their social role within the larger community. Group solidarity will not be sacrificed for individuals. So the teacher's development of NTC's identity is linked to and shaped by the school communal context in which they are embedded. Here I highlight a quote, but before I read the quote, I want to give some context. According to the principal, the school leadership team wanted to encourage NTC youth to learn about their mothers. Vietnamese mothers typically have a lower status in the home, so they may not necessarily talk about their backgrounds. The school team wanted to organize a school event for NTC youth to strengthen relationships with their own mothers at home. But the school leaders were concerned that if the event was focused just on NTC, it could actually disrupt the school's harmony. Consequently, other mothers from non-immigrant backgrounds were also invited to speak, to shift and broaden the event's focus from the true intent of learning about NTC culture and stories from NTC mothers to broadly learning from parents. So the quote from this teacher explaining this event is, at school events, school leaders ensured The participants would be NTC and also non-NTC students. During the activity, NTC can gain familiarity towards their mother's homeland and enhance their self-recognition identity. But it's important to see themselves together as a group. And within the group, there's no labeling because no NTC would be excluded. So there's nothing like you are and I'm not. The last core feature involved fostering harmony by treating students all equally and not singling out any group. And this was a school decision-making approach to promote NTC's identity. And here I'm actually referencing education's institutional role for social mobility. It's actually focusing on, in East Asia, central to legitimating modern schooling was the state guaranteeing that all children, regardless of backgrounds, studied under the same conditions to ensure fair and valid educational outcomes. Thus, universal access to quality education was achieved relatively early through a centralized state management of curriculum and teachers, as well as egalitarian distribution of funding that ensured all children were treated the same way in the education system. And this is actually reflected in this school decision-making approach that sought not to single out students. Teachers actually referred to a right way of fostering harmony, and that way was by treating students the same and avoiding singling out a group while developing NTC youth identity consciousness. The wrong way sought to treat students differently. This reified group boundaries at the expense of group solidarity. So to give an example, I highlight a teacher talking about the school approach to decision-making. Non-NTC youth think it's unfair. NTC youth receive lots of school resources and opportunities. So when the school decides on policies and practices on the NTC topic, we're very careful. We don't want our policies and practices to put on a label, to be labeled like, I'm treating them extra nice. If you treat NTC youth differently, then it's unfair to them, to NTC youth. Additionally, non-NTC will dislike them because of that. If you treat NTC youth better and they get better treatment, others wonder why they receive preferential treatment. And here I actually want to highlight another example just because, just to give a richer understanding of this core feature. So let me give some context. The principal gave a scenario in which a researcher desired NTC youth to take a psychological test for research purposes. The principal was very clear in saying that a wrong practice was visibly requiring only NTC youth to take this test and excluding non-NTC youth. The principal believed this approach was not right because it reinforces NTC's negative stereotypes that they're inferior and undermining their identity development. Instead, a right approach would be to require all youth, regardless of background, to take the test, even if only the results of NTC youth would be analyzed. The principal acknowledged the data collected from the non-NTC youth might not be useful, but according to the principal, only this right method will let students feel that you're being fair. When I do it this way, people would think that I'm treating everyone equally. So given these three core features, it's important to, moving forward in terms of the practices, two right practices emerged in responding to immigrant background student differences without singling out a group. Both practices showed evidence of school educators responding to immigrant background youth's unique needs while considering group harmony and relationships. Ultimately, both practices sought to strengthen cohesion within the school community. So I'll be going over each one. And the first is establishment of an inclusionary group. And this means creating a group in which all group members will benefit, in this case, NTC and non-NTC youth. So the principal and the leadership team were intentional in framing the school strategy to empower NTC youth within this broader international education umbrella to benefit all students regardless of background. So the school principal shared, international education is a higher lens by which all students can benefit. Actually, non-NTC students need this lens as well. In this way, NTC students won't be ignored. So international education encompass cross-cultural trips for students to visit schools in other nations, including Vietnam. The school offering a variety of international languages, including Vietnamese, and the school hosting students and teachers from other countries, including Vietnam. So in this way, all students were able to participate without singling out NTC students as benefiting. And the school chose this international education lens over affirmative action because they believe that affirmative action policies by the school would be considered as unfair by non-NTC students. The second type of practice focuses on secrecy or invisibility. And the purpose of this secrecy is to minimize labeling of difference. A teacher actually shares, we secretly respond to students' different backgrounds, but on the surface, it looks the same. So before I go into the quote, I want to give some context of what it's referring to. There was a donor who provided a large amount of funds to sponsor students to visit Southeast Asia. The donor had the stipulation that 2/3 of the students chosen had to be NTC. And so the principal believed that making such a requirement so visible to the students would actually cause that non-NTC students to feel that this was unfair, that NTC had an advantage. So this was how the school responded. The school provides opportunities to all students. We tell them it's all fair. So on the surface, it seems like everyone's the same and has equal opportunity for selection. However, NTC are the priority. Only extra spaces are given to non-NTC students. It looks the same on the surface, but actually it isn't. It's artificial. So in this case, what's interesting is that it's kind of like an iceberg where on the surface, what's visible is it seems like NTC and non-NTC youth have an equal opportunity for selection. But in actuality, what's visible is actually different from what's hidden. So the hidden practice is that the teachers are selecting, giving NTC youth the advantage. They're just not telling the students because of thinking that it would actually lead to bad feelings among the students. So this was another way in which teachers and staff sought to address differences by not singling out groups. So what I just shared with you is a rough attempt to develop an alternative multicultural approach to the globally dominant model. This paper specifically draws attention to 3 contexts of the macro and exo system that influence Taiwanese teachers' multicultural practices as an initial attempt to reconceptualize multicultural education. These 3 features include the whole person development, which focuses on the Confucian understanding of education for socializing children for life, including respecting parents. The second core feature includes strengthening the collective school unit, which means not sacrificing school solidarity to develop the identities of one group of students. And the last is a school decision-making approach that prioritizes fairness. This references in East Asia, the particular institutional context in which modern schooling was rapidly accepted because it was believed that the state ensured students received equal treatment and resources in the education system. And so teachers really applied this and really wanting to make sure that students had equal treatment, which ensured fairness. Of course, more in-depth research across Asia's diverse contexts is needed. One potential line of research that I see is really comparing harmony as an implicit pedagogical practice among teachers with no formal training, as in the study, compared to harmony as a state multicultural goal with formal training, as in Singapore. Another way of thinking about this is really viewing harmony as a cultural value versus a politically motivated goal, and the ways in which how this context can really shape practices in the classroom, as well as policies. Another important implication is creating culturally appropriate teacher training materials in East Asia. As I mentioned before, the literature documents Asian teachers struggling to implement best practices from Western contexts because of the cultural dissonance. However, teacher training materials developed from this pedagogy would actually enable cultural congruence with East Asia's context, allowing these cultural values to be considered an asset rather than a problem. In terms of contributions to multicultural education and the broader educational community, this study really seeks to validate Taiwanese teacher practices from non-dominant educational and academic communities as legitimate multicultural practices to be used in our pedagogical toolkits in how to respond to student diversity. Second, this harmony-oriented pedagogy seeks to demonstrate productive ways of recognizing difference without destabilizing social cohesion. In doing so, it addresses a limitation of the existing US-based global multicultural education model, which is that it fosters separatism and threatens social unity. The reason why critics believe this is because this US model emerges from the US context, which historically values individuality and rights, oftentimes recognizes and accommodates identities by singling them out. For example, Asian Pacific Islander Heritage Month, ethnic studies courses focused on a particular minority group, and affirmative action policies. Of course, these recognition policies single out groups can actually foster unintended consequences, including among the target group. It can promote internal stigma among them as they start to second guess their own giftings and whether they received an opportunity because of privilege and advantage or because of their qualifications. It can also harm non-targeted groups by external stigma of doubting qualifications of those in the target group. Of course, I'm neither promoting nor rejecting affirmative action policies, but I am focusing just on the unintended consequences of these policies. Third, I also want to highlight how this pedagogy serves as a foundation to develop a collective critical consciousness in pursuing social justice. So the strength of the harmony-oriented pedagogy is it's a group-oriented approach, which is an asset in developing critical consciousness and social cohesion. Here, I'm actually referring to multicultural work in Japan, where it's been documented that students from the Buraku, and these are considered the untouchables in Japan, and non-Buraku students are able to develop a collective critical consciousness. And I'm going to read actually from Keita's work Teachers apply group-oriented approach to intentionally structure children's learning experiences such that they develop deep personal commitment to classmates' well-being inside and outside school. Through journaling and dialogue with classmates and teachers, children learn that their struggles at school and home, and even those of their classmates, are linked to broader social and structural issues. Such social political consciousness, coupled with feelings of strong group attachment, motivate youth to engage in civic action to address these issues on behalf of their classmates and for themselves. And lastly, I believe that there's actually a lot of potential to engage in new lines of critical multicultural research that investigate marrying social cohesion and equity. So there's not a need to sacrifice one for both. And being able to contextualize these practices to the local context in which the researcher is studying. So yeah, I'm very excited to share my findings with you and to discuss this further. Thank you.